The nose was already dropping when Captain Kim Campbell rolled off her gun run, the skyline of Baghdad filling the bottom of her canopy like something you'd see in a nightmare. She had been working a concrete overpass above the Tigris, walking 30mm rounds across positions where Republican Guard fighters had dug in tight against the riverbank. Third Infantry Division troops were pinned below, close enough that a bomb would have killed the very men she was trying to pull back from the edge. The gun was the only tool fine enough for that kind of work, and she had used it the way she had used it a dozen times before. What she had no way of knowing was that a missile crew 3 streets over had spent the last several minutes studying her flight path, and they had just been handed everything they needed. The armored push into the capital had turned the riverbank into the kind of grinding, close-quarters mess the A-10 Warthog was designed for. Friendly tanks and enemy guns sharing the same cloud of dust. A concrete overpass sitting over the whole problem like a lid someone had welded shut. The margin for error was about as wide as a parking space. Get it right, and you were the best thing that ever happened to the soldier on the ground. Get it wrong, and you became a headline nobody wanted to read. Her flight lead, Lieutenant Colonel Rick Bino Turner, took the first pass. Campbell set up behind him. They punched down through the cloud deck for a look. Friendlies hugging the west bank. The bad guys stacked around the overpass on the far side. Bino rolled in, put the nose on the north bank, and squeezed the trigger. The sound reached the ground half a second late. Not so much a gun as the sky being torn down the middle. A line of 30mm rounds walked across the bank and threw up a wall of dust and broken concrete. The airframe shuddered with the recoil, roughly 10,000 pounds of it, about the shove of a parked SUV thrown backward. More thrust than either one of those 2 jets could produce on its own. Hold the trigger long enough and the gun actually drags the airplane a few miles an hour slower. It is the only aircraft in the inventory that fights its own physics every single time it shoots. What Campbell was carrying was the GAU-8 Avenger, 7 rotating barrels, 3,900 rounds per minute. Each 30mm round, purpose-built to punch through Soviet tank armor from 4,000 feet. Total gun system weight, 4,000 pounds, roughly the car sitting in your driveway. 65 rounds per second. They did not design the gun for the jet. They built the jet to carry the gun. The A-10 was never going to win a beauty contest. It was built for exactly the kind of days Baghdad was having right then. The cannon was the only tool precise enough for that fight. The army troops were danger close. A bomb dropped there would have caught the very men it was meant to protect. The gun was surgical by comparison. At that range, 8 out of every 10 rounds landed inside a 40-foot circle, right where she put the nose. When your own people are barely 100 yards away, 40 feet is the whole ballgame. Bino's rounds hammered the north bank. The problem was the south side. Most of the Republican Guard had pulled in directly under the overpass. When Campbell rolled in behind him, her rounds cracked off the top of the concrete deck and ricocheted away into nothing. The fire ripping out from under that bridge never even flinched. Those men had not crawled under there to hide from the army on the ground. They had crawled under there to hide from her in the air. The slab over their heads was the entire plan, and it was working. So they would have to stop diving at the roof, come in flat and low from the south, straight down the enemy's line of sight. The 2 Warthogs reset, swung wide, lined up from the south, dropped low, and leveled off to slide the fire in under the deck instead of skating it across the top. This time, rockets. They tore off the rails in a ripple of smoke, screamed in under the overpass, and hammered the south side positions across a 40-foot strip of concrete. The fire that had been pinning the Third Infantry Division finally went quiet. The pods under the wing carried racks of unguided 2 3/4-inch rockets. Unguided means exactly what it says. No GPS, no laser, Nothing inside hunting for a target. A rocket like that is a dart. You aim it by aiming it yourself. Hold the nose rock steady, let go, and trust the physics the rest of the way. And buried inside that small success was the whole problem. To put rockets under that deck, Campbell had to fly straight, slow and predictable, right down the same corridor as the pass before, and she had to do it more than once. She knew exactly what that asked of her. A slow, repeated telegraph line is how a Warthog gets bracketed by a gunner. She flew it anyway, because the men on that bank had run out of other options. Baghdad that spring was about the worst place on earth to fly a straight line twice. The city was thick with shoulder-fired missiles and anti-aircraft guns on the rooftops, almost none of them with a radar that would trip a warning tone in the cockpit. On the ground, the Iraqi guns had gone quiet. The runs had worked, but a few streets over, the SA-7 crew had been tracking the whole thing, and they had just been handed exactly what they wanted. They were not amateurs. They knew that firing on a jet that could see them coming was a wasted shot, so they had stayed silent through the first 2 passes and let her teach them her flight path. Now they had a fixed heading, a steady speed, the same slice of sky for the 3rd time running. Campbell had no warning of any kind. As far as her instruments were concerned, the sky was still empty. The crew did not need a lucky break anymore. They needed a few more seconds of an airplane doing exactly what it had done a moment before, and that airplane was about to give it to them. The passes that saved the soldiers were the very ones that set her up. Campbell pulled off her last pass and started to climb. Nose coming up, her belly rolling open to everything on the ground. Slow, heavy, and for the first few long seconds, the most exposed she would be all day. About as nimble as a minivan reversing out of a packed parking lot. The whole pale underside of the jet turned up toward a city full of people who wanted it down. A missile coming up off a rooftop now would reach her before she ever saw the smoke trail. The SA-7B Grail found her. Shoulder-fired, infrared-guided. No radar beam, no warning tone. It locks onto the hottest thing in the frame and runs it down before the pilot ever hears the launch. 18 pounds, Mach 1.5, cost about the same as a used pickup truck. The jet it just hit, $11 million of American taxpayer hardware, and the woman inside it. The blast hit somewhere behind her and the whole airframe lurched sideways. A hammer blow she felt in her spine before she even heard it. The left wing dropped, and the nose followed it down until the only thing left in the canopy was Baghdad rushing up to meet her. She hauled the stick back. Nothing. She hauled harder, both hands now, and the jet did not so much as twitch. The controls were soft and weightless. The Warthog was rolling itself toward the rooftops on a schedule all its own. Whatever that missile had hit, it was already worse than a single unlucky shot. She just could not see how bad yet. For one stretched second, she had no idea whether the jet was still in one piece or already coming apart around her. Then her eyes found the panel, and the whole story was sitting in 2 gauges, both hydraulic needles sliding towards 0. The engines somehow still running just fine. The fuel state set an hour to Al-Jaba. Her arms were already burning from wrestling the stick across the city. And somewhere underneath the noise, a question she could not answer. How long before the mechanical backup, keeping the nose up, decided it had taken enough stress and stopped answering altogether? The A-10's designers had been paranoid about exactly one thing: a single hit taking out the controls. So they doubled up. 2 hydraulic systems instead of 1, run down opposite sides of the jet on purpose. Each pulsing 3,000 pounds per square inch, enough muscle to swing control surfaces a pilot could never drag around by hand against the wind. Lose one to a leak, and you ride the other one home. Same logic as carrying 2 separate power steering pumps. If one quits, you can still steer. but the shrapnel had not found one of those systems. It found both, and it took more than her controls with it. Those same hydraulics ran the gun. In one stroke, the missile had not just taken her controls, it left her unarmed over a hostile capital in a jet stripped down to bare metal. No muscle left on the controls, and nothing standing between her and a mistake. Just a heavy jet, a hostile city, and a pilot with seconds to decide. On almost every other airframe in the sky, that is the sentence where the pilot stops flying and starts riding it down. Campbell had run this exact emergency in the simulator more times than she could count. The simulator never makes your hands shake or puts a hostile capital directly under your canopy. The ejection handles were right there between her knees, and punching out meant a parachute ride straight down into the people who had just shot her. So she left the handles alone, reached down, and threw a single switch into manual reversion. Nothing. Then the nose crept up, and the jet stopped pointing at the city and started slowly climbing away from it. It was flying again. Part of the answer was something that had happened before the missile ever hit. Campbell was riding inside a tub of titanium armor, roughly 1,200 pounds of it, about the weight of a grand piano wrapped around her, and built to shrug off a direct hit from a 23mm round. The one room in the house with its own bank vault, and that vault pulled double duty. The cables for the backup flight controls ran right through its floor. Most jets bury their controls in fluid and electronics, where one well-placed hit turns a fighter into scrap. The people who designed the A-10 refused to trust that, so they ran a simple mechanical backup in parallel and tucked it inside the armor. The same shielding that was keeping Campbell alive had just saved the only control system the missile had not reached. It still did not fly anything like an airplane. Every input came back heavy, mushy, and half a beat late. More like steering a waterlogged boat than a car. It took real muscle on the stick to get the jet to do anything at all. She could feel all of it because the Warthog fought her on the way into every turn and the whole way up. With the hydraulics gone, the controls fell back on the oldest trick there is. A tangle of steel cables and pulleys running straight from the stick out to the wing. But those flight control surfaces are huge. Without hydraulic muscle, they are far too heavy to drag around by hand against the wind. So the cables do not even try. They move one small flap on the trailing edge of the wing, no bigger than a ruler. That rushing air grabs the tab and swings the big control surface for the pilot. The entire situation at that moment was riding on a piece of metal smaller than a cafeteria tray. Picture a barn door in a hurricane. You could never shove it open against that wind on your own. But flick a small flap on the edge, just let the wind catch it, and the storm swings the whole door for you. That is manual reversion. The pilot is not muscling the jet through the sky. She is nudging the wind into doing it for her. Bino's voice came across the radio with the only thing that mattered. Get rid of the weight. She pickled off what was left under the wings and watched it tumble away toward open ground. The Warthog breathed a little easier without all that drag. Then she brought the nose around to the west. The trouble was everything between her and the runway. In manual reversion, Campbell had lost every trick that spoils a gunner's aim. The hard brake was gone. A sharp maneuver was impossible. All the insane energy a healthy Warthog throws on instinct simply was not available anymore. The controls were too heavy and far too slow for any of it. All she could do was hold a heading and keep moving. Tracers came up lazy at first, then snapped past the canopy as gunners found the range. Every shooter down there had the same easy problem to solve. A big, slow jet that flew like it was bolted to a rail. Bino flew off her wing and called the threats as they came, since she had no real way to answer them. There were a lot of them. She counted the seconds between the worst of the fire and made herself breathe, because panic in manual reversion is its own way of going down. That is the cruel arithmetic of a wounded jet on manual controls. You cannot fly your way out of trouble by flying harder, because hard is the one thing the airplane has nothing left to give. You simply fly steadier. It is like white-knuckling a fully loaded moving truck with no power steering down a highway where every other driver is trying to run you off the road. Holding a jet steady on those cables is real physical work. Every correction fought through raw mechanical resistance with almost no power assist behind the stick. Imagine trying to parallel park a freight train with a broomstick. Harder than anything you have ever done at the gym, and with much worse consequences for dropping the weight. Campbell's arms were already burning from wrestling the stick the entire way across the city. Grinding ahead a little at a time, she dragged the Warthog past the rooftops and climbed up over the weather into air that was finally empty and quiet. Crossing into open desert took the edge off, but it did not end anything. On the far side of that quiet sat a full hour back to Al-Jabba Air Base in Kuwait, and a decision harder than anything Baghdad had thrown at her. 3 clocks running at once. Fuel, 60 minutes to Al-Jabba, no margin for a missed approach. Her arms cramping and locking up after better than an hour of holding the jet on cables that fought her the whole way. And the manual reversion system itself, nobody at the factory had ever tested it for 60 unbroken minutes. Nobody knew where the breaking point sat on this particular jet after everything it had absorbed over the city. The empty sky was almost worse. An hour of nothing to do but feel every ache in her arms and run the math on a question that only had one answer. The checklist said, "Do not attempt it." Almost nobody had ever done it, and she was about to find out who was right. The real question was whether to land the aeroplane at all. The checklist is blunt. You put an A-10 down in manual reversion only under ideal conditions. It is so demanding that almost nobody has ever managed it. A 4-star chairman of the Joint Chiefs once noted that only a handful of pilots had ever pulled off a manual reversion landing at all. The manual practically begs you not to try. Conditions that day were far from ideal, but it was the only way not to go home in a box. Back at base, rescue helicopters were already spinning up, standing by in case she chose to step over the side instead of risking the runway. Bino slid in close to eyeball the damage. What he found did not make anyone feel better. More than 100 holes stitched across the fuselage and tail. A hole the size of a football punched clean through the right horizontal stabilizer. Shrapnel buried in the back of the right engine, which was exactly why he kept asking over and over how those engines were holding up. On paper, that airplane was already a smoking hole in the ground. It was still flying for 2 reasons. The first was luck. The shrapnel had missed a few things that actually finish a jet. The second was design, because the A-10 was built from the first rivet to soak up exactly this kind of punishment. The 2 engines sit high and far apart on the rear fuselage, so a hit that wrecks one tends to leave the other clear. Punch a hole in a fuel tank, and the foam packed around it swells up and seals the leak before it can spread. Same principle as a self-sealing tire closing around a nail instead of going flat on the freeway. Warthogs had come home before with 1 engine, half a tail, and chunks of a wing simply gone. Campbell's jet was leaking, smoking, and full of holes. It was also somehow still an airplane. That is when she made the call. The jet was flying too well to give up on, and there was too much waiting for her back on the ground. So she set up for the exact landing she had been warned against. With one enormous catch hanging over the whole thing, there would be no second try. She lined up on final and committed. 1 pass to get it right. A go-around in manual reversion needs the kind of crisp, instant control the jet simply did not have anymore. Pulling up, adding power, getting the gear down and locked, all while wrestling cables that answered half a beat late. First pass, and the only one she gets. She had flown this airplane for years and trusted it with everything she had. But that is a strange thing to lean on when the manual flat out tells you This landing is for ideal conditions only, and almost nobody has ever pulled it off. She slowed the jet down on purpose to see if it would still answer her near landing speed. One chance to find out, and a failing grade meant she did not walk away. It was the most expensive test of nerve in American military history. The gear dropped on the alternate handle because there was no hydraulic pressure left to swing it down the normal way. A few very long seconds, then green lights. Gear locked, gear down, brakes set to emergency. One approach, no go around. Every system she would normally lean on already gone. She eased the Warthog onto a long final, and for a few hundred feet, it flew like a gift, smoother than anything in manual reversion had any business being. Then, 60 feet up, the airplane decided it was done cooperating. It rolled hard left, all on its own. Her heart jumped into her throat as her hand followed it down, pulling the stick the other way, working that one small trim tab against better than 100 knots of air. The wings came back, but barely. The mains touched, the nose settled. The Warthog rolled straight down the centerline. Word of what Campbell was attempting had gone around the base, and pilots she had never met were on the radio, quietly willing her down. When the wheels held, the channel filled with voices telling her she had made it. The crash crews were already rolling as she taxied clear, and for the first time in better than an hour, she let herself believe she was going to walk away from this. She shut the engines down, climbed out, and finally saw what Bino had been staring at the whole way home. The holes were everywhere. A jet that looked like it had been fed through a shredder, and it had still carried her back. There is something about that moment, standing next to a machine that had every reason to quit and did not, that stays with you. Most of us will never face anything close to what Campbell faced that day. But most of us know what it feels like to keep going when everything is telling you to stop, and to wonder afterward whether the decision was courage or just stubbornness wearing courage's clothes. Honestly, it is worth asking yourself which one you think it was.